we are going to shift gears and welcome Executive Director Brendan Wells. Hopefully, please, tech work up to the screen. And, Brandon Wells, in the kind of CISA world, you have kind of political appointees. That's Jen, wonderful reputation, former NSA person as well. And then you kind of have the career folks. Brandon presided over the CISA VSA, Pulse Secure, Exchange Vulnerability. Let me ask you a second. Who do you think that impacted as an industry more? I would say MSPs. We all use this stuff, okay? So with that, Andrew Morgan, are you coming up here? Executive Director Wells, thank you for joining. Assuming you can hear me.
I can hear you. Great to be here.
Yeah. All right, so Executive Director Wells, I'd like to make sure that everyone in the audience understands sort of the full scope of CISA's mission and authorities. I'm not ever sure everyone quite appreciates, the full breadth of your cybersecurity mission across the Department of Homeland Security, all civilian federal departments, agencies, and with the private sector. Can you give us a sense of the scope? And first off, I also want to say thank you. I don't have any data to back this up, but this Right of Boom conference is really becoming, maybe a bad analogy, but the black cat of the MSP security infrastructure. If you think of small, medium business in the US, it's probably the largest IT footprint in our country. In this conference, you have about 600 plus folks here that are the kind of leading security MSPs and vendors in the space. So I can't thank you enough. But if you could give us a little bit of an overview of kind of CISA's mission, and I know your jurisdiction is way bigger than I think a lot of folks understand.
Sure, and first let me just thank you for the invitation. And you're right, I think we definitely want to talk to the MSP community. They're one of the most critical aspects of the segments of the IT marketplace, supporting state and local governments, the federal government, broad swaths of our critical infrastructure and small and medium-sized businesses. So they're an audience that's critical to the health of the broader ecosystem. So really happy to be here, even if it's virtually. CISA's mission is, as you note, very broad. So I would say, to start, we've got a much broader mission than just cyber. So we serve as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience across the entire federal government. And that means working with other federal agencies, the private sector, to make sure that our cyber and physical work that's happening every day to help improve the resilience of our critical infrastructure is on mission and working in a very synchronized way. But our cyber mission is equally as broad. As you note, we have some special responsibilities for the federal civilian executive branch, so working to harden and protect the non-military parts of the U.S. government network. That means working with 101 different federal civilian agencies, from some big ones like the Department of Justice down to micro agencies like the Marine Mammal Commission, making sure that their networks are as protected as possible. We do that in a lot of ways, from both monitoring what's happening on those networks to supporting incident response to provisioning tools and other capabilities they can use so that their security professionals can monitor those networks and take action as appropriate. But just as important is our work with the critical infrastructure and the private sector more generally. So we do that in a lot of ways, whether it's by sharing information, whether it's by providing technical assistance, whether it is by generating best practices or other products that help guide industry, whether big or small, kind of on the path of improved cybersecurity. So things like zero trust maturity models, or how do you think about hardening inside of it when you're for a small business? How do you think about hardening your access to managed service providers? Those are the kind of guidance that we try to assemble. We do that both through kind of our national level work here from Washington, D.C., but we also have more than 100 cybersecurity advisors throughout the country that are working with critical infrastructure owners and operators and state and local governments every single day on providing them assistance, connecting them back to our services, and a variety of other capabilities that we have. So it's a broad mission. It's one that we continue to refine and hone. So hopefully, as we get through this conversation, you'll hear me talk a little about the kind of feedback that we think is necessary to make sure that our evolving programs are meeting the needs of the community as this cyber ecosystem continues to evolve. And so we want to make sure that our programs are evolving with it and really looking for feedback from communities like this to make sure that there aren't gaps that we're not addressing.
Excellent. And, Director Wells, the one thing, I came out of the government and I heard CISA and I just think cybersecurity only. But I think you have a much bigger coverage over, kind of the kind of 16 sectors of critical infrastructure. Can you just give everyone a little bit of an insight into kind of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis and the things that aren't cyber? Because I had a complete misconception. I thought it was all cyber, but your mission is much, much broader than that.
Yeah, so, we serve as this national coordinator for the overall critical infrastructure mission, and that is across cyber, physical, natural hazards, et cetera. So that means that on any given day, we could be working on a wide range of issues. So one minute it could be kind of cybersecurity issues dealing with the latest nation state threats to our critical infrastructure. 2 hours later, we could be dealing with a support to local communities as they face physical attacks against electric substations like we saw in the Carolinas at the end of 2022, to the next day dealing with major natural hazards hitting some part of the United States, affecting our critical infrastructure and our professionals. And so I mentioned we've got 120 cybersecurity advisors out throughout the country. We have several hundred protective security advisors that are working with communities on improving their physical security, their resilience against all types of hazards. And so this gives us, I think, two important things. One, it has forced us to create kind of deep partnerships with the private sector to cover the range of issues that we deal with. And we have some unique authorities and ways in which we can bring the private sector together to get information and to work in partnership. And secondly, it allows us to, when we work with industry, to work with them in a kind of a holistic way. And I think that is one of some of the key lessons that we've taken out of particularly complex attacks that have disrupted critical infrastructure, things like Colonial Pipeline that had obviously a cyber attack, but that had, because of the actions that the industry took, physical impacts on the ability for that pipeline to provide its fuel to the East Coast. We need to be looking at these as interconnected systems, that the cyber attacks could generate physical impacts, that things that happen in the physical world bleed back into changing the nature of the cyber risk that those companies face. And so we want to look at these issues holistically so that when we support companies, when we work with them, that we're talking about building broad resilience. And in many cases, particularly when you're dealing with some types of infrastructure that may be incredibly challenging to secure from a cyber perspective, the thing that we talk the most about is building resilience. Can you actually sustain operations in the face of a disruption of your cyber systems? Because that's what the country really needs from you. When we think about some of the breadth of some of our critical infrastructure, 50 to 60,000 water utilities in this country, most of them extremely small. They don't have dedicated cybersecurity operation centers. The idea that they're actually going to be able to have in place highly sophisticated information security programs is just not realistic. And so what we often talk to them about is, okay, what can you have as a baseline given your limited resources and capacity? But more importantly, what else are you doing to make sure that even if your IT systems were disrupted, that you can continue to ensure that your community gets clean drinking water? And there is a lot that they can do from that perspective. And so I think that is something that our agency, kind of unique amongst our counterparts around the world that often are very focused just on cyber, don't have this holistic look at our critical infrastructure. And I think that is a strength of our approach.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, if you think about it for the audience here, 50 to 60,000 water treatment facilities. We all know what the really small local government looks like. They have a big, broad mission. Yeah. Director Wells, we also have joined with me on stage Andrew Morgan, who's the brainchild of this entire event and put it on. Much grateful to it. And I know he'd like to ask you a question as well.
Yeah. First off, again, Executive Director Wells, thank you. Really grateful for you joining us. Few things I just want to touch on. One, you mentioned water treatment. I'm just a few miles away from Oldsmar, Florida, where a small, you know it well, where we're seeing those types of attacks, and often, MSPs are involved supporting those organizations. I'm going to come to the question around hybrid cloud, but just for a minute. But I think it's really important for this group to understand really the purview you have had personally on things like Russia, Ukraine, but then SolarWinds, the CISA event, Pulse Secure. Can you frame that out, again, your unique vantage point personally and what you oversaw, but then the question behind that is post-COVID, everything's shifting, I shouldn't say everything, huge portion of things are shifting up to the cloud where M365 seems, and BEC and phishing seem to be the attack du jour. And I want to ask you about where you see the threats going in our hybrid world. But first, I think this audience would love to hear your purview on what you've overseen. It's amazing.
Yeah, so I had the distinction. I'm not sure that I wish it upon others. In November of 2020, shortly after the election, the previous director of CISA was fired, Chris Krebs. I took over as acting director of the agency. And I'll be honest, I thought that my focus at the time was going to be on kind of closing out the 2020 election work that we had been doing for the past several years, and that we were going to be focusing in on some work that we had been doing to help secure the vaccine supply chain against COVID. That was a particularly fragile period as the vaccine was just starting to roll out. And I thought this was going to be the kind of focus of the agency while I helped to shepherd it through the political transition to the new administration. That lasted for about a week until Saturday afternoon when I get a call from Kevin Mandia, who lets me know that FireEye had been compromised. Met with him and his team that following week and realized that was a pretty serious compromise, very serious situation that FireEye had dealt with, and that was just beginning to fully understand the scope. And that lasted all of another about 2 weeks before I got a call from Microsoft letting me know of what then became the SolarWinds compromise, but obviously was much more than just SolarWinds, was actually much more focused on trying to access Microsoft Office 365 in the cloud. And I'll say to your point, what we saw during the move during COVID, the move towards hybrid work environments, they're fully remote, is that massive increase in attack surface, the kind of propagation of the criticality of those edge devices like VPNs became the go-to target for our adversaries. They were constantly looking for vulnerabilities in VPNs, because they knew that they were going to be able to hide much more in the massive increase in remote traffic. And secondly, it kind of dramatically changed the nature of work inside of CIO and CISO shops across the country. And they were beginning to adapt to this new environment just like everyone else. And it meant that they may not always have had time to make sure that their systems were deployed in the most secure and redundant fashion possible, that they had the right level of logging on critical new devices on their networks, et cetera. And I think the combination of those two led to somewhat of an explosion in cyber-related activity. But so, started dealing with SolarWinds in late November, early December 2020. Incredibly challenging, U.S. government compromise, critical infrastructure compromised, a very sophisticated attack, highlighting some real weaknesses in our ability to understand what was happening in the cyber ecosystem, even inside the federal government where we had much greater visibility. But even in those cases, both we and the agencies themselves lacked visibility, particularly at kind of critical endpoints on the network, things that we've had to remediate over the past 2 years, thanks to some additional resources from Congress. We get into 2021, and then we dealt with what was then just the stream of major cyber incidents over the first 7 months of the year. The Hafnium attack against Microsoft Exchange servers affecting tens of thousands worldwide. We had the compromise of Pulse Connect secure devices, again, going to those exact VPNs that were a high priority target for adversaries. Very sophisticated targeting of VPN devices, knew exactly how to get in, how to hide their tracks using zero-day vulnerabilities. some pretty exquisite tradecraft used to hide for a prolonged period of time inside of those networks. We then had Colonial Pipeline and CISA, JBS Foods. I think people had assumed that the kind of cyber Pearl Harbor was going to be one big attack all at once. But I think in reality, what we have seen over the past several years is that the cyber Pearl Harbor is not one big event. It is the death by 1,000 cuts, some bigger than others and some smaller. But it is the kind of consistent stream of significant attacks that are very disruptive. I was actually talking to one of my colleagues who worked here during the Obama administration, has come back in during this administration. And we had worked together during some of the big events during the Obama administration, like the OPM breach and Sony, the attack on Sony Pictures. And if we would have thought that back then, that we would have seen hospitals being shut down and diverting patients, and that major communities would be shut down for prolonged periods of time, we would have believed that this would have been kind of like DEFCON 1 level urgency of the threat. But because over the last 10 to 15 years, we've just been in the pot, slowly turning up the heat of the frog that we all are, in the cyber world, I don't think we have really fully realized how pervasive cyber incidents are and the effect that they're having on day-to-day life of American companies and American citizens and American communities. And I think we have seen that, we had a particularly bad period in early 2021, but frankly, we continue to see this on an ongoing basis. It's just that we're in the middle of it, dealing with it incident by incident, and haven't ever taken a step back to say, what does this actually look like? And it's actually been pretty, it's a pretty bad situation. We have to really kind of, I think, make some radical rethinking about the way in which we broker technology for us to kind of get out of it, because I think this whack-a-mole approach of trying to deal with this incident by incident, company by company, trying to secure incredibly complex technology has proven to be not a very successful approach.
Got it.
Yep. I'll go next, yeah. So, Director Wells, you presided over arguably one of the more disruptive attacks in recent memory with the Colonial Pipeline attack. I think it affected the Northeast because the pipeline actually runs right by my house in Maryland, but I saw folks run to the gas station in Florida and other places. I don't know if that was,
Well, if there's a hurricane, John, we run.
Yeah, you do that too.
If there's bad weather,
Andrew's
we
from
run.
Florida. So I was curious, what were your biggest sort of takeaways, lesson learned, and we don't want anything sensitive, but any insight that's not really common knowledge from that attack?
Yeah, so I think that there's a variety of lessons learned from Colonial, and they run from the ones that should be the most obvious to the ones that I think are more complicated. The obvious ones are, if you don't know what's on your network, you can't secure it. And so in this case, Colonial compromised through a VPN that happened to have single-factor authentication on it. Was a small mistake with obviously big impacts, but obviously we know the challenges with hardware and software asset management. But those are those basics. That blocking and tackling is going to be what's critical to making sure that you can do the more sophisticated things better. The second is this idea of the interconnectedness between your cyber and your physical systems. Do you understand what those connections are? Do you know how to appropriately address those when cyber systems are compromised? And have you thought about the responses that you will take, the downstream effects those will have? Because the reality is Colonial Pipeline was not shut down by the adversary. It was shut down by the operators who shut down the operational technology, the control system for the pipeline to potentially protect it because they weren't 100% sure that they'd be able to secure it from potential connection points between their IT and OT systems. But that wasn't, I think, well understood. And I also think that it was not clear that Colonial Pipeline necessarily had a good understanding of how a system was segmented, architected, so that it would have more confidence in the actions it could take inside the moment. And obviously, when your CISA is running to you, telling you that your network's been compromised and you need to shut it down, they shut it down. But the then downstream effects were pretty significant. And obviously there was a lot of panic among the American people, leading to kind of gas lines even before there were shortages. So there weren't actually really shortages. They were just shortages driven by increased demand because of fear and panic buying. And I do think that the good thing that came out of Colonial Pipeline, if there is a good thing, is that I think it did that, combined with JBS Foods, really hopefully shocked a lot of companies out of complacency, that this is not somebody else's problem, and that you do not want to be the next CEO of a major piece of critical infrastructure that's been hit by ransomware. So I do think that we saw kind of in the post-colonial period an increased willingness for companies to work with the government, to begin taking action related to cybersecurity, to begin to make those types of investments that would hopefully avoid this happening in the future. But I don't think it was enough. And although I do think that it led to some change in the kind of consciousness of corporate America, we still see too many companies that deal with IT and cybersecurity as kind of a secondary matter and not as a kind of core business interest that should be driving kind of CEO and board level oversight of the cybersecurity, information security programs that companies operate today.
Yeah. I love what you started off saying, Executive Director Wales. We're going to take a quick Hippocratic oath here in our MSP version of Control 1 and Control 2, that we and our clients are going to take asset management more seriously. But wanted to switch gears. We mentioned CISA, and would love your perspective, because especially this group in here takes cybersecurity really seriously. A lot of these organizations do all the right things, but we were talking about whether it was SolarWinds or in this case CISA, it was a supply chain attack, and you could be an MSP doing everything correct, but all of a sudden you and your customers are owned because of a supply chain risk. Any advice you might give MSPs in this case, because you oversaw two of the most prolific ones that have impacted IT companies?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts here. So first, I want to give credit to CISA, who I think was a good partner as soon as they realized they had a problem, both in terms of making sure that their customers were aware of what happened and what was happening and the status, and also working with the government. I will say that the day of, I was speaking to the CEO of CISA, helping to kind of organize our team along with the FBI to make sure that we understood what was happening, the potential customer impacts, and any support that they needed to kind of respond to this incident. But so I think that there are certainly kind of key things that are lessons for both the MSPs themselves as well as the customers of MSPs, those small, medium-sized businesses largely that rely upon managed services. So on the MSP side, I do think that outside of how you respond to an incident and making sure that you're extremely transparent about it, as CISA was, one thing we are trying to focus more on is, are you making your products securable by default, and are you making it easy to operate? So are your systems easy to configure, or is it too complicated, and so you're leaving your customers more exposed than they may necessarily need to be because they don't fully understand, or they don't have the staff, they don't have the technical capacity to be able to kind of operate inside of your systems? And I think we have seen too often where customers don't configure their connections with their managed service provider correctly, they don't harden some key aspects of it, and they leave themselves exposed, even if that capability probably was in there, but just wasn't easy enough for their clients to be able to take on. So making sure that your product is securable by a less than sophisticated audience, particularly when we start dealing with small businesses, since that's going to probably be what you're facing there. Second is this idea of secure by design. So we are beginning to look at what are the factors that we are encouraging all software developers for how to make their systems more secure by design, by default, whether it's mandatory use of multi-factor authentication or using memory-safe coding languages to avoid a lot of the compromises that happen because of memory safety challenges in code. So are you kind of building your systems in a way that these are going to be secure? When it comes to the customers, it's all about understanding how do you utilize an MSP in your network. Are there things you could be doing to make sure that it is, if there is a disruption, you can handle it, that it doesn't bleed over into your network, that it may not actually move in and fully compromise your network, if at all possible. Obviously, there's going to be different classes of MSPs providing a lot of different services. Obviously, managed security service providers are going to be in a class by themselves because those will often have pretty deep access into customer networks. But I think this was a kind of a key issue we saw in SolarWinds, is that you should only give your these connections the amount of permissions that are necessary. So in the case of SolarWinds, if you had configured your SolarWinds device to have full access to the open internet, you are more likely to be compromised than not. But you didn't actually need your SolarWinds device talking to the open internet to be able to perform its function on your network, which was kind of network optimization. But people, to make patching easier and faster, just left it with a full-time open connection to the internet. But I will say we saw many, including U.S. government customers of SolarWinds that had shut those permissions off, locked down that system, and even though those would likely have been a high priority target for Russian SVR operators behind SolarWinds, they were not able to get to those networks. And I think that's the same for MSPs. You should only be giving your managed service provider as much permission as the minimum amount of permission necessary to execute their tasks on your network, and no more. And there are a lot of things that are set up for convenience that, in hindsight, with a little bit of additional effort, could make these networks more secure. And so I think a lot of this comes to the interplay between the MSP and their customers, and what that dialogue looks like. How the advice that you're providing down to your customers about how to configure your systems in a more secure way, the ease at which that happens, your customers' ability and willingness to utilize their systems in this way. And so those are some key aspects. I will say, we just released the planning agenda for our Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, which is our primary mechanism for operational collaboration between CISA, our rest of our U.S. government cybersecurity partners like the FBI, NSA, and others, and our kind of industry partners in the technology and cybersecurity world. And one of the agenda items that we said we're going to work on this year is focused on improved ways in which we are securing managed service providers, managed security service providers, remote monitoring services, all of which have kind of unique access to critical infrastructure networks. And we want to make sure that we're providing additional information beyond some of the guidance and hardening guidance that we've already released in this area.
Really cool.
Yeah. Director Wells, one thing that was interesting, I still remember it was, I think, 10:40 a.m. East Coast when, kind of one of my employees said, hey, I think there's a new 0 day. And I do have to commend, the government's response in CISA. The thing we didn't know at the time was if it affected the cloud and on-prem, because this was right when it was popping off for the first time. And I got to say, I don't know if the audience knows, it's one of the best things CISA did was shut off the cloud, because it allowed us, the security vendors, to take a pretty rapid response and knock off the on-prem servers, which saved a lot of companies. So, can't commend CISA and your organization enough in the heat of the battle. Forgetting the stuff that led up to that, I thought it was a really, really good play, and clearly the USG took that event very serious, because it really disproportionately affected SMB and the MSP community, because that's, core capability that they use. So, slightly switching gears, you talked about Pulse Gear, the CISA, the exchange stuff, again, really hit the MSP and SMB space. And as a result, cyber insurance carriers lost an incredible amount of money. And they've been struggling to figure out, obviously, the one surefire growth area is cyber insurance, right? We're only going to need more. So for them, they want to figure out how to control the risk. But I felt like I watched it get really unhealthy, where they didn't want to, kind of really cover MSPs as much. Premiums went up. What's the U.S. government's take on balancing this risk? Is it regulation, education? Is there something similar to FDIC with the banks, so the carriers are more motivated to protect what is critical infrastructure for small medium business America?
Yeah, so this is an incredibly complicated question because cyber insurance is so relatively new, even though it's been around for probably more than a decade now. I think we have seen over the past several years that insurance companies, frankly, didn't price the market correctly and suffered for it during the kind of rise in ransomware. Now, I would argue in some cases the insurance market fueled that same rise in ransomware because they made payment of ransoms far easier to happen and put a lot of companies under retainer to negotiate with criminal organizations. Now, I think they are repricing the market. So I think cyber insurance premiums have gone up across the board, not just for MSPs, as I think cyber insurance companies have realized that actually, because of the ubiquitous nature of cyber attacks right now, premiums needed to be higher. We also believe that there is a special responsibility on these cyber insurance companies to do the kind of due diligence that is necessary to assure an adequate level of cybersecurity in the companies that they are insuring. I think the insurance companies have realized that the due diligence that they were doing 5 years ago was not adequate to give them the confidence that the risks were being managed. And frankly, from our perspective, that insurance wasn't being used as a moral hazard, that you're just paying for insurance instead of paying for the cybersecurity that we actually need. And that's beginning to change. And so there's a lot of conversations there, but there's still some gaps. One thing that CISA and the Department of Treasury are working on is an examination of whether there should be a federal backstop for catastrophic losses in the cyber insurance market. We actually had a public RFI, where we received a lot of input from industry. We're doing some work on that now. The national cyber strategy that will be released soon will touch upon this a little bit more. But I do think that insurance, even with or without a federal backstop, is likely to be only one part of the approach, and that there is no silver bullet that's going to solve some of these big challenges that we're facing. And so you are likely to see the U.S. government expand regulation in some areas, and we're already doing that in places where we had authority but hadn't fully exercised it yet. So you saw that in the wake of Colonial with TSA using some of its existing authority over the transportation sector to put in place minimum cybersecurity standards for pipelines and rail, and now moving on to aviation and airlines and airports. You're seeing places like EPA look at new potential authority, using existing authority to kind of attack this problem. So regulation is going to be a piece. Insurance is going to be a piece. The continued kind of operational collaboration between government and industry is obviously going to be a continued piece. And I think frankly, a lot of the burden is going to remain on industry. And I think that's why I mentioned this earlier, why we want and why we need kind of corporate America to realize that cybersecurity is a core business risk and needs to be managed as such. And because this is a shared responsibility, the government is working hard to figure out what additional things it can do to help the ecosystem. But the technology companies, cybersecurity companies, MSPs, the end users, the critical infrastructure, the small and medium-sized businesses, everyone has a piece of this and is going to have to take ownership over that piece.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic advice. It's really good to hear the government's kind of looking at backstopping, whether it happens or not. I think one takeaway I get for the whole audience is you can see when you take a step back and look at the cyber footprint writ large. There's been a lot of disruption in the past kind of year and a half, and if you needed motivation to just bake it into your stack instead of upselling and this and that, it simplifies your business operations. I think it's good. You can see here from Director Wells, we have to take a lot of this responsibility and work hand in glove with the government. And so to me, the big takeaway, Andrew, is really you got to figure out how to have that base, and it's all packaged in. I mean, we're very reliant on technology as businesses in 2023, and so I think we should treat it the same way. So Andrew, I think
Yeah,
The,
let me just add that I
Sure.
think that's a great point, and it's one of the things that we have been pushing, kind of, this special responsibility of the technology providers to bake in security is so critical. And, I'll use one statistic, which, when we received was somewhat frightening. I think it was 30%, only 30% of Microsoft Enterprise Cloud is behind MFA. For their enterprise customers, only 30% have MFA enabled. That just means 70% of those people have a much higher chance of compromise through the most simplistic of tradecraft. And I think I think we're seeing other places try to make that change. Salesforce has now said that they're going to move towards, full MFA for every one of their clients by default and things like that. So we think that kind of building this stuff in, making it easier, making sure security is turned on up front is just so important because frankly, that's the way the customers are going to make sure that they use it. I think we are part of this ecosystem, and as I said, kind of we all have a role, and I think that's going to be a key role of the technology community going forward.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, wow. I'm smiling and I'm not smiling, Executive Director Wells. And what I mean by that is in my opening comments, I made reference, and everybody was here, to a company that's in our ecosystem called SAS Alerts. And they do SAS monitoring, and 32% was the stat of MFA on Office 365, holistically deployed. And so when you said it, I was like, holy cow. So I just want to put a few, maybe just painting just on the canvas, because you mentioned a few things. I'd love for you to run with this a little bit. So you mentioned, for example, cyber insurance. I call it the unregulated regulator because, we went from, 5 questions and a heartbeat, and here's your $1 million, $2 million, $7 million. Now we're at 9 pages and requirements and denials, et cetera. So in essence, they're doing a decent job. You mentioned not using the word, but a word that really SMB doesn't know on the margin is governance, ownership of, really that they have ownership in this whole piece. And then the other piece being that the overarching supply chain and MSPs, I think, wondering, is regulation coming our way? To us directly, to organizations that, hey, if you're working with an SLTT, where CISA is now directing $4 billion over the next X amount of years, and you have, fair amount of skin, and thank you for doing that, because obviously this is huge, but we touched that. So I'm just wondering, I think, and the MSPs at large are probably wondering, is regulation coming our way in some way, shape, or form in this whole grand scheme of things, if that makes sense? And it doesn't have to be specifically answering yes or no.
It's hard. I can't say that there's going to be regulation around MSPs. What I can say is that I think regulation is clearly going to be a tool that the government looks to in this space to manage some of that unmanaged risk right now. But I think, going to your point, what we have encouraged people to do, and I think this in some respects builds on the executive order that President Biden signed in May of 2021, where you can use your contracting authority, and we're trying to do that at the federal government, to impact the ecosystem. So what are the conditions, what are the cybersecurity conditions you're going to build into your contracts with your providers? That could be of MSPs, but it could also be of other people who are kind of critical inside of your operations. And so I will note that when I talk to big companies from every sector, whether it's big airlines, big manufacturing companies, major banks, their number one concern is third-party risk. So it is always that kind of supply chain where they think that their weaknesses are likely to be most exposed. And they can control some of that using their contractual relationships with those providers. I think we are trying to do that from the federal government, trying to influence both the technology we buy to make sure it is more using secure software development practices that NIST has established, trying to bake that into more federal procurement. We encourage states to put cybersecurity requirements into their contracts for services writ large. And I think that is, we think, an important way because it sets really clear expectations between the customer and their provider around what needs to be done and what's the baseline that we expect. I think that there are still challenges in this space, particularly when your supplier and your vendor is a small company, doesn't have a lot of resources, can't really fully address the maybe some of the stronger cybersecurity requirements that could be baked into these contracts. And so we've often talked to companies about what they could do to extend their security envelope over some of these third-party providers because they are so critical to their operations. If a small company is essential to your business being functional and they can't do the basics of cybersecurity, what can you do to help them get to a place where that's done? There are parts of the community where that is being done with more regularity, particularly in places like the defense industrial base and others. But it is something that we're encouraging. I think we publish a lot of our kind of best practices guidance are really geared towards those small and medium-sized companies. Large companies with sophisticated programs who have CrowdStrike under contract and 3 other security vendors. They don't necessarily need as much from us in terms of best practices, but certainly their suppliers and vendors will. And so can you encourage them to go through our cybersecurity performance goals and get in place those kind of baseline controls so that they have a little bit more confidence in the security of those systems. I didn't really, I don't think, address the heart of your question because I think what Congress will do in the future related to regulation is anyone's guess. But it is going to be a tool the government uses. But in the absence of that, there are a lot of other of these tools that we're going to utilize, whether it's how do we effectively work with the insurance companies to put in place the right level of due diligence, whether it's 9 pages or 12 pages, and what kind of assessments they're doing, whether it is using procurement and contracts to help make changes in the ecosystem, whether it is pulling companies into a broader security regime, getting them linked up with an ISAC in the community so they're getting more information pumped to them. There's a lot of different tools out there, and it's a matter of how do we pull them all together to maximize the security benefit that we're getting.
It's almost like, to kind of round it out, it's carrot and stick, right? It's like you mentioned the defense industrial base. It's like, hey, if you're in that supply chain and you want to be part of this contract, third-party risk, we're going to come downstream and look at your cybersecurity hygiene. And if you're in it, great, we'd love to have you. And if you're not, you're probably going to have to do some stuff, regulated or not, to be in this contract.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a nice segue to, MSPs have always supported SMBs, right, for a long, long time. The thing we're all seeing a lot more is direct support, administration of state, local, tribal territory government, across the U.S. And we see a lot of correctional institutions, pretty much anything you could ever imagine. What are some of the resources CISA has specifically for those MSPs that are serving those SLTTs?
Yeah, so I think as Andrew mentioned, we are just started rolling out a new grant program focused on the state and local tribal territorial community. It's got a current 4-year life cycle coming out of the Infrastructure Investment Act, and the first money is going out the door as we speak, actually. And that program is putting money in the hands of state and local governments in order to kind of build that baseline level of cybersecurity there. The money goes to the states, but 80% of it has to go down to the state and locals, and that whether it's money directly or whether it is support provided. And what we've actually seen is a lot of states are kind of setting up kind of a support apparatus to help enable local governments to kind of be utilize shared services that a state can provide. So in a lot of grants, the money is flowing down to a state, then gets sent out to a county to actually buy the fire trucks. In this case, the state is going to keep some more of that money because they're going to set up a shared service program that now works to kind of secure that local government. I think what is really important is that this connection between the state government and local governments is strong. because we know that the local governments in particular are going to be weak here, and they could benefit from both the resources and technical capacity of the state governments. And so several states, for example, have good practices. They use kind of cyber navigators where they're actually going down into communities and helping them get to a higher level of security. We are certainly providing not just that, money in this case, but providing a lot of tailored services. Congress actually established, I want to say 2 years ago now, kind of a state cybersecurity coordinator position in CISA. So in every state capital, we now have a CISA employee cybersecurity focused on working with that state government for what it can do to make sure that it's getting the right resources it needs, that it's utilizing the right practices, that it's taking benefit from some of the technical services that we offer, whether it's vulnerability scanning or assessments or red teaming, et cetera, particularly if they're not getting that from third parties. I think MSPs need to be a part of that conversation with their customers in this case. If a customer that they're working with is now moving in under a state-provided program to do hardware asset management or vulnerability disclosure, how does that MSP kind of feed into that? Make sure that it's well connected there, and that's obviously in addition to the kind of direct connections that we can have on the ground with relevant players.
Executive Director Wells, I know we had scheduled 45 minutes, and to be respectful of your time, I know we're at that. Do you want us to wrap up with one final question for you? How are you, sir?
Yeah, we can maybe two final questions. I got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you so much. One that comes to mind is I think Cloudflare just announced the largest DDoS attack in history. And to cut the question short in interest of time, do you see potentially DDoS attacks being used in lieu of or in combination of with malware or locker type things? I mean, is the attacks changing, and do you see that based on what your purview is?
So I think in some cases we see DDoS attacks in their own right, KillNet continuing to do those to kind of be a nuisance in light of U.S. support for Ukraine and other Western countries. But I think the question that you get in terms of are they using this? Could they do it for ransom? Other things? I think this is part of the cat and mouse game we have with cyber criminals broadly, where they were using traditional ransomware for a while. Then they realized they may not have been having complete success. People weren't paying as much. They were having backups, so they started moving towards dual ransomware, where we'll lock up your stuff, plus we'll threaten to release your info on the dark web to kind of extort money from you that way. So it would not be a surprise that if people start to lock things down in that way, then they'll shift tactics. They'll use other techniques, so they'll try to do them in combination. So that is very plausible, and I think we will continue to see evolution in how particularly the lower tier cyber actors utilize combination of tactics to kind of achieve their goals. I would be very concerned about DDoS potentially being used to cover up or kind of shield from other activity that may be happening targeting networks. So that is obviously a kind of a concern that's out there, but not one that we've seen, I think, fully play out.
Yeah. So basically, however, as detection catches up, we're gonna pivot as a threat actor. Yeah.
I have one last softball question for you. What can we as citizens and MSPs do to help support you and your agency in your mission?
Yeah, so this is a great question because as I said, we are all part of this community. We all have different roles, and we all have to do our best to work together to kind of get at this problem. I think that there's a couple of things that we want everyone to do. Kind of as MSPs, we want you to, as I mentioned earlier, take responsibility for the software that you're actually providing to your customers. We know that it's your livelihood. In many cases, it may be your customer's livelihood. Think about how security plays into that in a way that's easy to use, easy to configure on by default to make the community more secure. Secondly, I would think about what you can do to kind of evangelize this to your peers, and that we want this to be kind of the standard across corporate America. So what can you do to kind of advance that to make things and make the community stronger? And third, I would say, think about ways in which you can help build the cyber workforce of the future. We get a lot of questions about cyber workforce, and the U.S. government has things like grants and putting money out to communities and hosting interns and fellows, et cetera, at the government. But the cybersecurity talent needs to be across this country. We need cybersecurity talent in local governments, as we've been talking about, in municipal water systems, and that's going to happen in community colleges and local communities throughout the country. So, I think because this community is unique. It's a tech industry that is not all centered in Palo Alto. You could be out there helping to build that ecosystem. What are the relationship that you may form with your local college, your local community college, your local technical college? How can you help sponsor additional work in this space? Doesn't have to be a lot, but I would say every bit helps. And this is a space where we need to increase that pipeline. And this community can be a key part of helping to accelerate that pipeline.
Well, Executive Director Wells, I know your schedule is extremely tight, but I can't thank you enough for taking some time out of your day to talk to us. We're extremely humbled and honored, and I hope this is a great kickoff for a really close partnership between the MSP community and CISA. We're here to help, so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, guys. Great.
What do you think?